Picture this: a Roman emperor, poised on the brink of war, turns not to his generals or his maps, but to the night sky. He waits, not for scouts or spies, but for the movement of planets and the alignment of stars. He believes, with every fiber of his being, that the heavens themselves hold the key to victory, that the cosmos can be read like a battle plan, and that destiny is written in the light of distant suns. This wasn't some isolated superstition or a fleeting moment of doubt. This was military strategy on an imperial scale, a practice so deeply woven into the fabric of ancient warfare that it shaped the rise and fall of empires. From the deserts of Mesopotamia to the forums of Rome, rulers didn't just glance at the stars for inspiration. They weaponized them, turning astrology into one of history's most surprising and sophisticated tools of war. Think about that for a moment. Long before satellites, drones, or real-time intelligence, commanders looked upward for guidance, trusting celestial patterns to dictate when to attack, when to retreat, and even when to forge alliances. They commissioned detailed horoscopes for entire campaigns, believing that the position of Mars could influence the morale of their troops, or that a solar eclipse could spell doom for their enemies. This video is going to pull back the curtain on that hidden dimension of history, a world where the cosmos was an active participant in warfare, where the fate of thousands could hinge on the interpretation of a comet's tail or the transit of a planet. We're going to meet the astrologer priests who stood beside kings, decode the ancient manuals that served as military field guides, and walk through legendary battles where the stars were believed to have tipped the scales. By the time we're done, you won't just see the night sky as a beautiful tapestry of light. You'll see it as an ancient battlefield, a silent witness to centuries of conflict where human ambition met celestial mystery. You'll understand how the belief in a connected universe influenced everything from the timing of a naval raid to the morale of a legion on the march. This is a story about power, psychology, and the profound human need to find order in the chaos of war. It's a journey into the minds of emperors and soldiers who saw the heavens not as a distant mystery, but as the ultimate weapon. So let's begin where it all started, with an emperor named Augustus, who stared into the stars and saw a path to victory. To understand how the stars became weapons, we have to travel back over 4,000 years to the Fertile Crescent of Mesopotamia, the very cradle of civilization. Here, in the city-states of Sumer and Akkad, the first military commanders weren't just kings and generals, they were priests. These priestly advisors, known as Baru, held immense power because they alone possessed the skill to read the will of the gods. And they believed the gods spoke not through whispers, but through the majestic, silent movements of the heavens. A sudden eclipse wasn't just a celestial event. It was a dire warning from the moon god, Sin, potentially signaling the death of a king or the downfall of a dynasty. The appearance of Venus near the constellation Leo might be interpreted as a promise of victory, while Mars dipping below the horizon could be a clear command to postpone an attack. For a Mesopotamian king contemplating war, these celestial omens were as crucial as counting his spears or securing his supply lines. He was making a divine calculation, seeking permission from the cosmos itself before committing his army to battle. This practice was meticulously recorded on clay tablets, some of which have survived millennia, giving us a direct window into this ancient mindset. One famous example comes from the city of Mari, where a priest sent an urgent report to his king, Zimri-Lim, warning him not to travel on a specific day because the omens were unfavorable. The king, it seems, heeded the advice, This wasn't mere superstition. It was an integrated system of intelligence gathering and risk assessment. The night sky was their satellite imagery, their early warning system. They developed detailed charts and calendars, noting the predictable patterns of planets against the fixed backdrop of stars, and began to see correlations between these patterns and events on Earth. The success of a harvest, the outbreak of disease, or the outcome of a border skirmish. They were building the first predictive models of warfare, all based on the belief that heaven and earth were mirror images intimately connected. From Mesopotamia, this knowledge didn't stay put. It flowed along the great trade routes and the paths of conquering armies. The Egyptians, with their own deep astronomical traditions, absorbed these ideas. Pharaohs like Thutmose III would have consulted their own priest astrologers, aligning military campaigns with the rising of the dog star, Sirius, which also heralded the life-giving flooding of the Nile, a powerful symbol of renewal and strength. But it was the conquests of Alexander the Great that truly acted as a catalyst, smashing the barriers between East and West and creating a vibrant new cultural melting pot. Greek scholars in Alexandria, armed with Mesopotamian data and Egyptian traditions, began to systematize everything. They moved beyond simple omen reading, if this star appears, then this will happen, and developed a more complex mathematical astrology. They began to cast horoscopes for the birth of ideas, for the founding of cities, and crucially, for the launch of military campaigns. This Hellenistic period gave us key figures like Hipparchus, who mapped the stars with unprecedented accuracy, and texts that would become the bedrock of all Western astrology. They formalized the zodiac, assigned planetary rulers, and created the complex web of aspects and houses that turned the sky into a detailed, readable map of fate. For a military leader, this was a revolution. It was no longer just about reacting to a single bad omen. It was about choosing the most auspicious moment, down to the very hour, to initiate action. They could, in theory, plan an attack for a time when Mars, the god of war, was strong and angular in the chart, while Jupiter, representing expansion and victory, favorably supported it. This was the ultimate strategic advantage, a way to launch a campaign with the conviction that the universe itself was marching in step with your army. This sophisticated framework, born in the academic centers of the Hellenistic world, was the direct precursor to the practices that Roman emperors would later rely on to build their empire, proving that the quest for a tactical edge has always driven innovation, even when that innovation was written in the stars. With this powerful intellectual framework spreading across the known world, it was only a matter of time before ambitious empire builders seized upon it. The Persians, under visionary leaders like Cyrus the Great, didn't just conquer territories, they absorbed knowledge. The Magi, a powerful priestly class within the Persian Empire, were far more than just Zoroastrian religious figures. They were scholars, advisors, and crucially, master astrologers. For a Persian king, consulting the Magi before a campaign was as standard as reviewing the condition of his cavalry. They would meticulously track the movements of the planets, which they viewed as physical manifestations of divine beings. A favorable alignment of Jupiter and Venus might signal the perfect time to offer terms to a rebellious satrap, believing the celestial harmony would encourage a peaceful submission. Conversely, if Mars appeared particularly bright and aggressive in the night sky, it could be interpreted as a direct command from the god of war to unleash a swift and overwhelming attack. This wasn't a vague hope, it was a calculated decision-making process deeply embedded in the imperial command structure. The movement of entire armies, the timing of crossing great rivers, even the logistics of supplying distant garrisons, all could be influenced by the readings of the stars provided by the king's trusted Magi. They provided a layer of divine sanction that solidified the king's authority and united his diverse armies under a common, cosmic purpose. No figure better exemplifies the practical application of this cross-pollination of astrological knowledge than Alexander the Great. As he carved his unprecedented path of conquest from Greece to the borders of India, Alexander didn't travel with just soldiers and engineers. His mobile court included a retinue of scholars and, most importantly, astrologers from every culture he encountered. He was a brilliant pragmatist, and he understood that controlling people meant understanding what they believed. In Egypt, after being declared the son of Zeus Ammon by the oracle at Siwa, he consulted Egyptian priest astrologers who used their ancient stellar lore to help him plan the founding of Alexandria, choosing a moment astrologically auspicious for a city destined for greatness. When he marched into the heart of the Babylonian Empire, he didn't dismiss their traditions, he embraced them. The Babylonian astrologer priests, the direct descendants of the Mesopotamian Baru, possessed astronomical records stretching back centuries. They could predict lunar eclipses with remarkable accuracy. For a general like Alexander, this was priceless intelligence. Knowing an eclipse was due could prevent his own superstitious troops from panicking, or alternatively, he could use the event to his advantage, perhaps by launching an attack as the enemy was thrown into disarray by what they saw as a terrifying omen. The true power of this astrological integration lay in its effect on the most crucial element of any army, morale. A soldier fighting in the ranks of Alexander's phalanx wasn't a modern, secular warrior. He believed the world was alive with gods and spirits. When his commander announced that the stars were aligned for victory, it wasn't empty propaganda, it was a tangible infusion of courage. It transformed a risky assault into a divinely sanctioned mission. This belief system directly impacted military logistics and strategy. An army might delay its march for days, waiting for the moon to enter a more favorable phase, not out of indecision, but because moving under the wrong sign was considered an invitation to disaster. Foraging parties might be sent out on specific days deemed astrologically safe, while the timing of complex maneuvers, like the crossing of a major river, could be scheduled for a moment when the water signs were dominant, promising safe passage. This celestial guidance created a powerful sense of shared destiny and divine favor that held armies together across thousands of miles of foreign territory, enabling the fusion of Greek, Persian, and Egyptian tactical knowledge into a single, unstoppable military machine under a leader who was himself becoming a living legend, backed by the very heavens. This systematic approach to the stars reached its zenith with the Romans, who took the mystical traditions of the East and forged them into a powerful instrument of statecraft and military doctrine. For the pragmatic Roman mind, astrology was less about fatalistic prophecy and more about a practical methodology for reducing risk and maximizing advantage. It was a tool for governance, and no one understood this better than Julius Caesar. While Caesar himself was a supremely practical commander, his adoption of a reformed calendar based on Egyptian solar calculations, the very Julian calendar we still use a version of today, shows his appreciation for ordering the world through celestial knowledge. This act wasn't just administrative. It was a profound statement that Rome's destiny was now synchronized with the cosmos itself. More directly, Caesar's personal astrologer, a figure named Spurina, famously warned him to beware the Ides of March. While the dictator famously dismissed the warning, its chilling accuracy only served to cement the reputation of astrological advisors in the Roman political imagination, proving that even the most powerful man in the world could not afford to ignore the heavens. But it was Caesar's adopted heir, Augustus, who truly weaponized astrology for the imperial project. Augustus didn't just consult astrologers, he brilliantly marketed his own celestial destiny as a core tenet of his rule. He publicly circulated the horoscope of his birth, which supposedly predicted his meteoric rise to power. Coins minted during his reign featured the zodiacal sign of Capricorn, his ascendant sign, transforming a personal astrological detail into a symbol of the new golden age he claimed to be ushering in. This was masterful propaganda. By linking his rule directly to the favorable and immutable movements of the planets, Augustus presented his authority not as a matter of political fortune or military might, but as a preordained fact of the universe. For the common soldier and citizen alike, this was a powerful argument. To rebel against Augustus wasn't just treason, it was to fight against the very fabric of fate. He used this cosmic narrative to justify his wars, to consolidate his power after the brutal civil wars, and to present his reign as one of peace and prosperity decreed by the stars. This imperial endorsement led to the formalization and systemization of military astrology. It became a standard practice for Roman generals and later emperors to have an astrologer on their staff, much like a modern commander would have an intelligence officer. These specialists weren't fringe mystics, they were respected advisors. They employed a branch of astrology known as Astrologer Militaris, which provided specific rules for warfare. They would determine the most auspicious moment, or kairos, to declare war, to mobilize legions, to engage the enemy in battle, or to sign treaties. The position of Mars, naturally, was scrutinized with intense focus. If Mars was retrograde, appearing to move backward in the sky, it was often considered an exceedingly bad time to initiate hostilities, a belief that could delay entire campaigns. The moon's phases were critical for night operations or for moving troops under cover of darkness. This wasn't seen as superstition but as prudent planning, a way to stack every possible advantage in their favor by aligning human action with the perceived rhythms of cosmic power. This Roman system was so advanced that it produced detailed instructional manuals. The most famous of these is the Mathesis by Firmicus Maternus, a sprawling 8-volume work from the 4th century that dedicates entire sections to the astrology of war. Firmicus provides his readers, who would have been high-ranking officials or military advisors, with precise recipes for interpreting celestial events in a military context. He details how to read a chart to see if a battle will be bloody or bloodless, whether a siege will be successful, or if a rebellion is likely to arise within the ranks. For example, he might advise that if Jupiter is well placed in the chart cast for the beginning of a campaign, the army will be well provisioned and loyal, but if Saturn is afflicting the moon, it could indicate treachery or a sudden, devastating ambush. This level of detail shows how deeply this knowledge was integrated into the strategic planning of the empire. The heavens became a vast, interactive command map, and the astrologer was its essential interpreter, helping to guide the immense machine of the Roman war effort for centuries, proving that belief in the stars was considered as vital to conquest as the sharpness of a gladius or the discipline of a legion. As the Roman Empire fractured and the classical world gave way to the Middle Ages, one might have expected the sophisticated system of military astrology to fade into obscurity. But knowledge, like water, finds its way through the cracks of history. While Europe entered a period often characterized by intellectual fragmentation, a vibrant new center of learning was flourishing in the East, one that would not only preserve the astrological traditions of Greece and Persia, but would radically advance them. The rise of Islam and the rapid expansion of the caliphates created a vast, interconnected empire that stretched from the Iberian Peninsula to the borders of India. Within this realm, a monumental project of translation and synthesis began. Caliphs in Baghdad, acting as great patrons of science and philosophy, commissioned scholars to gather all the world's knowledge. Greek texts by Ptolemy, Aristotle, and Plato, along with Persian and Indian astronomical works, were meticulously translated into Arabic. This wasn't a simple act of preservation, it was a renaissance. In the great library known as the House of Wisdom, scholars pored over these ancient texts, critiquing, correcting, and expanding upon them. They refined the astrological models they inherited, making more accurate planetary tables and developing new techniques. For the military commanders of the expanding Islamic empires, this refined astrological science became an indispensable tool for planning their campaigns across 3 continents. A key figure in this intellectual revolution was the 9th century polymath al-Kindi, often called the philosopher of the Arabs. Living in Baghdad at the height of the Abbasid Caliphate, al-Kindi was a true Renaissance man centuries before the Renaissance, writing hundreds of treatises on everything from mathematics and music to cryptography and medicine. Crucially, he was also a master astrologer. He wrote extensively on what was known as judicial astrology, the application of celestial knowledge to human affairs, including matters of state and war. For al-Kindi, the universe was a perfectly interconnected whole, a great clockwork of cause and effect where the movements of the heavens directly influenced events on Earth. He advised rulers on the most auspicious times to launch military expeditions, to besiege a city, or to engage an enemy force. His calculations weren't based on superstition, but on a complex philosophical system that blended Aristotelian physics with astrological principles. He might advise a general to wait until Mars was in a particular sector of the sky, associated with heat and aggression, to begin an assault, believing that this celestial configuration would literally inflame the spirits of his soldiers and weaken the resolve of his foes. This provided Islamic commanders with a powerful strategic framework, allowing them to time their operations with a confidence that they were acting in harmony with the fundamental laws of the universe. Meanwhile, in a Europe still reeling from the collapse of Roman authority, the relationship with the celestial arts was far more complex and ambivalent. The official stance of the Christian Church was often one of deep suspicion, with figures like Saint Augustine condemning astrology as a dangerous denial of free will and an affront to the omnipotence of God. Church councils periodically issued decrees against the practice, aiming to suppress what they saw as pagan divination. Yet, despite this official disapproval, the belief in the power of the stars never truly vanished. It persisted in folk traditions, in the practices of local cunning folk, and perhaps most surprisingly, in the courts of kings. The most famous example is Charlemagne, the great Frankish emperor who was crowned Holy Roman Emperor on Christmas Day in the year 800. While he promoted Christianity throughout his realm, he also maintained a personal astrologer, a scholar often identified as the English monk Alcuin of York or others within his learned court circle. Historical accounts suggest that Charlemagne, a brilliantly pragmatic leader, would consult on the timing of his military campaigns. The choice of when to march against the Saxons or the Lombards might be influenced by readings of the planets, seeking a moment of celestial favor to ensure victory, and just as importantly, to bolster the morale of his troops who still held onto older, pre-Christian beliefs. This illustrates a fascinating duality in medieval Europe, public condemnation of astrology coexisting with its quiet, practical application by the very powers that claim to reject it. This era powerfully demonstrates that the desire for a tactical advantage is a universal constant, one that transcends rigid religious and cultural divides. A Christian king in Achin, a Muslim caliph in Cordoba, and a Byzantine emperor in Constantinople, though they might be theological adversaries, all shared a common language written in the stars. They all looked to the same planets, the same eclipses, and the same comets for guidance. The methods of interpretation might differ slightly. An Islamic scholar might place more emphasis on lunar mansions inherited from Indian tradition, while a European astrologer might rely on a Hellenistic text preserved in a monastery library, but the core belief was identical. The cosmos was not a random void but an ordered system, and by understanding its rhythms, a commander could navigate chaos of war. This wasn't a story of isolated superstition, but of a continuous, evolving science of strategy that flowed along the trade routes and battle lines of the medieval world, proving that the heavens were a battlefield upon which all empires, regardless of their faith, sought to gain the high ground. So how exactly did a military astrologer do his job? What was in his toolkit, and what methods did he use to translate the silent movements of planets into actionable battlefield advice? It's a fascinating process that moved far beyond simple stargazing into a highly specialized form of strategic calculation. These advisors operated using three primary branches of astrological practice, each serving a distinct purpose in the theater of war. First was horary astrology, the art of answering a specific, urgent question based on the exact moment it was posed. Imagine a general on the eve of a decisive battle, unsure of the enemy's true numbers or whether a promised ally will arrive in time. He would turn to his astrologer and ask his pressing question. The astrologer would then cast a chart for that precise moment, reading the positions and relationships of the planets to divine an answer. The placement of Mars might reveal the enemy's strength. The condition of Mercury could indicate the reliability of communications or the potential for treachery, and the Moon's aspects might show the likely outcome. This was the ancient equivalent of a real-time intelligence briefing, offering a cosmic perspective on immediate tactical dilemmas. For more long-term planning, commanders relied on electional astrology. This was the practice of choosing the most auspicious moment to initiate an action. You wouldn't just declare war on any random day. You would meticulously calculate the perfect celestial window for success. An astrologer would scan the heavens for months in advance, searching for a date when the beneficial planet Jupiter was strong and well aspected, ideally supporting a rising Mars to ensure martial vigor, while the malefic influence of Saturn was minimized. The launch of a campaign, the signing of a crucial treaty, the coronation of a new emperor, all were timed using electional techniques to ensure they were imbued with the most favorable cosmic energy possible. It was about planting a seed of action in the most fertile astrological soil, giving the endeavor the best possible chance to grow and flourish. This required an incredible amount of foresight and planning, turning the astrologer into a key strategic planner who could dictate the entire timeline of a war. On the grandest scale was mundane astrology, which focused on predicting large-scale world events, the rise and fall of empires, major economic shifts, periods of famine or plague, and of course, the outbreak of great wars. Practitioners of mundane astrology studied major celestial events, conjunctions of Jupiter and Saturn, the paths of comets, and especially solar and lunar eclipses, interpreting them as portents for entire nations and regions. A significant eclipse occurring in the part of the sky associated with, say, Persia might be read as a dire warning for its ruling Shah, suggesting a coming period of instability or invasion. This big-picture analysis allowed empires to anticipate periods of global conflict, prepare for natural disasters that could weaken their enemies, or even identify moments of perceived weakness in a rival nation's astrological profile, potentially justifying a preemptive strike. It was the strategic overview that informed decades of imperial policy. To perform these complex calculations, the military astrologer needed his own form of hardware. His most vital tools were precise star charts, known as astrolabes or later as volvels, which were intricate rotating disks that mapped the heavens for any given time and location. He carried detailed books called ephemerides, essentially astronomical tables that listed the daily positions of the planets years, even decades, in advance. Without these, he was lost. He also relied on specialized astrological calendars that highlighted propitious and dangerous days for various activities. Using these instruments, his advice could be incredibly specific. He wouldn't just say, "Attack next week." He could advise that the army should break camp at dawn on a particular day when the moon was in Aries, a fiery and initiative-taking sign, and that they should march in a specific direction to align with the flow of celestial energy. He might recommend that the command tent be pitched on a certain plot of ground under the influence of a favorable star, or that the blacksmiths begin forging new swords when Mars was at its peak elevation in the sky to imbue the blades with strength. This was the ultimate fusion of the mystical and the practical, turning the entire cosmos into a dynamic, interactive map for conquest, a system of intelligence gathering that guided the fate of armies long before the first spy ever crossed a border. Nowhere is the profound impact of this celestial strategy more vividly illustrated than in the history books themselves, where the outcomes of legendary battles were inextricably linked to the movements of the heavens. The most iconic example is arguably the final, decisive clash of the Roman civil wars, the Battle of Actium in 31 BCE. The forces of Octavian, the future Emperor Augustus, faced the combined might of Mark Antony and the Egyptian Queen Cleopatra. On paper, Antony held several advantages, including a larger fleet and veteran legions, but Octavian possessed a weapon his rival could not match: the unwavering belief that the stars were on his side. His personal astrologer, a learned man named Theogenes, had cast his nativity years before and allegedly proclaimed that the young man's destiny was almost unbelievably grand. Octavian never forgot this, and he leveraged this celestial endorsement relentlessly in his propaganda. In the lead up to Actium, his camp was flooded with promises of victory framed in astrological terms. His soldiers and sailors were told that the planetary alignments favored their cause, that the god Mars was championing their general, and that the very fabric of the universe opposed the Eastern decadence of Antony and Cleopatra. This wasn't just a vague feeling, it was a targeted psychological operation. When the two fleets finally met in the Ionian Sea, the morale of Octavian's men was unshakable. They fought with the conviction of men who believed they were fulfilling a cosmic destiny, while Antony's forces, perhaps aware of the ominous predictions against them, may have been plagued by doubt. The battle was a rout, sealing Octavian's fate as the master of the Roman world, and proving that a well-timed horoscope could be as devastating as a well-aimed catapult. Centuries later, and hundreds of miles to the north, a similar drama played out under the English sky, demonstrating that this belief in celestial warfare had lost none of its power. The year was 1066, and Duke William of Normandy was preparing his audacious invasion of England, challenging the newly crowned King Harold Godwinson. As his invasion fleet was being assembled, a spectacular celestial event occurred: the appearance of what we now know as Halley's Comet. To the people of the 11th century, a comet was not a predictable ball of ice and rock. It was a terrifying and utterly unpredictable omen, a brilliant, silent scream in the heavens that signified upheaval, the death of kings, and the fall of dynasties. The Bayeux Tapestry, that famous contemporary embroidery of the conquest, vividly depicts this moment. It shows King Harold sitting nervously on his throne, his courtiers pointing anxiously at the star with long, fiery hair in the sky, interpreting it as a dreadful portent of his impending doom. For William, however, this same comet was a divine signal of approval. His court astrologers and religious advisors spun the narrative that the comet was a sign that God sanctioned his claim to the English throne, that it was a heavenly sword clearing his path to victory. He used this interpretation to rally his nervous nobles and to attract mercenaries, promising them that they were joining a divinely blessed campaign. When William finally landed on English soil and met Harold's army at the Battle of Hastings, that belief in a righteous, heaven-supported cause likely played a crucial role in the ferocity and resolve of the Norman troops. They fought not just for a duke, but under a sign from God himself, a psychological advantage that may have been the critical factor in the close-fought battle that changed the course of English history forever. These two examples, separated by a millennium, reveal the dual-edged nature of astrology in combat. It was never just about one side having an astrologer and the other not. It was about the perception of cosmic favor. A positive prediction acted as a powerful force multiplier, welding an army together with unbreakable confidence. Soldiers who believed they were destined to win would fight harder, hold the line longer, and remain loyal in the face of adversity. They saw their general not just as a tactical leader, but as a man chosen by fate, and they shared in that reflected glory. Conversely, the mere rumor of an unfavorable omen could unravel an army from the inside. News that an eclipse was due or that Mars was in retrograde could spread through a camp like a plague, sowing fear, paranoia, and desertion. Commanders knew this, and they engaged in active astrological warfare, using spies to spread disinformation about terrible celestial signs plaguing their enemy's camp. The battlefield, therefore, existed on two parallel planes: the physical clash of men and metal on the ground, and the invisible, psychological war fought in the minds of every soldier, a war where the most powerful weapon was a story written in the stars. The commander who could best control that narrative, who could convincingly claim the heavens as his ally, often held the real key to victory long before the first charge was ever sounded. While planets moved in their predictable, stately dances across the sky, it was the sudden and terrifying appearance of comets and eclipses that truly sent shockwaves through ancient armies. These were not part of the orderly celestial plan. They were shocking, unpredictable disruptions in the fabric of the heavens, and they were almost universally interpreted as direct messages from the gods, and rarely were they good news. A comet, with its brilliant, ethereal tail slicing through the familiar constellations, was seen as a celestial sword, a harbinger of death, revolution, and the downfall of kings. Its appearance could freeze an entire military campaign in its tracks, as commanders and common soldiers alike looked upward in dread, wondering which royal house would fall or which nation would be plunged into war. The psychological impact is almost impossible to overstate in our modern, rational world. For an army on the march, a comet was not an astronomical event. It was a divine verdict hanging in the sky, and every man felt it was meant for him. This fear was a tool that shrewd commanders learned to wield with precision. We already saw how William the Conqueror brilliantly reframed the appearance of Halley's Comet in 1066 as a sign of divine favor for his invasion, but he was far from the only one to turn celestial panic into a strategic advantage. In the ancient world, the mere rumor of a comet could be just as powerful as its actual appearance. A general might have his spies spread word through an enemy city that a comet had been seen, a blatant lie designed to sow dissent and fear among the populace and the defending troops. They might whisper that the omen clearly pointed to the downfall of the current ruler, making citizens less likely to support a doomed regime and soldiers less willing to fight and die for a cause the gods had already abandoned. This was information warfare at its most elemental, using the universal language of the sky to manipulate human emotion on a massive scale. The cosmos itself became a canvas for propaganda, and the most successful leaders were those who could best control the narrative written upon it. If comets were seen as divine warnings, then eclipses were something far more terrifying, the wrath of the gods made manifest. Imagine the experience of a soldier in a vast ancient army. The sun is high in the sky, and then, without warning, it begins to vanish. The world plunges into an eerie, premature twilight. The air grows cold, stars appear at midday. Birds fall silent. For a people who believed the sun was a god itself, this was the equivalent of watching the universe die. The panic was immediate and absolute. The historical records are filled with accounts of battles halted and sieges abandoned because of an eclipse. The ancient Greek historian Herodotus tells a famous story of a solar eclipse that interrupted a battle between the Lydians and the Medes in the 6th century BCE. The fighting stopped instantly, both sides seeing the event as a clear sign of divine anger at their conflict, immediately laid down their arms and negotiated a peace treaty. The eclipse, in effect, did what years of diplomacy could not. It ended a war. This profound fear created predictable patterns of behavior that could be anticipated and exploited. A clever general who knew an eclipse was coming, perhaps from captured astronomical records or from his own court astrologers, could use it as the ultimate psychological weapon. The most famous example of this comes from the exploits of Christopher Columbus during his fourth voyage to the New World in 1504. Stranded on the island of Jamaica and running out of supplies, Columbus and his men were being refused aid by the local Taino people. Consulting his almanac, Columbus saw that a total lunar eclipse was imminent. He called the Taino leaders to a meeting and told them his Christian God was angry with their lack of hospitality and would soon make the full moon appear, inflamed with wrath as a sign. When the eclipse began exactly as predicted, the terrified Taino people rushed to supply the Spaniards with everything they needed, begging Columbus to intercede with his deity. He did, timing his return to coincide with the eclipse's end and solidifying his power through a perfect act of celestial theater. This story, though from the age of exploration, perfectly illustrates a principle understood by military commanders for millennia. Knowledge of the skies granted power over those who feared them. The true genius of using these celestial events lay in this psychological manipulation. It wasn't that the stars themselves reached down to change the course of a battle. It was that the deeply held beliefs of the soldiers did. A general who could confidently announce that an eclipse had been foreseen and that it actually signaled the favor of the gods for his army could transform a moment of potential disaster into one of triumphant certainty. His troops would watch the event unfold not with terror, but with awe, seeing their leader as a man so powerful he was even privy to the secrets of the sun and moon. Meanwhile, the enemy army, operating under the default assumption of divine anger, would be plunged into disarray and despair. In this way, a natural alignment of celestial bodies could demoralize an enemy, break a siege, or secure a surrender without a single drop of blood being spilled. The battlefield was first and always in the human mind, and the most brilliant commanders of the ancient world knew that the heavens offered the ultimate high ground for winning that crucial, invisible fight. But the reach of celestial strategy was not confined to the dusty battlefields of the ancient world. It extended far beyond the shoreline, onto the vast, unpredictable, and terrifying expanse of the open ocean. For a naval commander, the stakes were infinitely higher. On land, a wrong decision might mean a lost battle. At sea, a wrong decision could mean the complete and utter annihilation of an entire fleet. swallowed without a trace by a merciless and unknowable deep. In this environment of supreme uncertainty, where the whims of wind and wave held the power of life and death, the ancient mariner clutched at every possible source of guidance, and the most reliable map they believed they had was written in the stars above. This wasn't a matter of simple superstition. It was a sophisticated system of maritime science that seamlessly wove together practical astronomy for navigation with judicial astrology for timing, creating a comprehensive cosmic doctrine for naval power. The Phoenicians, those legendary seafarers of the Mediterranean, were masters of this celestial art. Centuries before the rise of Rome, their sturdy ships ventured from their home ports in modern-day Lebanon all the way to the tin mines of Cornwall and possibly even around the coast of Africa. Their incredible voyages were made possible by an intimate knowledge of the night sky. They navigated by the North Star, which they called the Phoenician Star, using its fixed position to maintain their latitude. But their understanding went far beyond mere wayfinding. They timed their departures from harbor with meticulous care, consulting astrological calendars that dictated the most auspicious days to begin a trading expedition or a colonial venture. Launching a ship on a day ruled by a water sign like Pisces or Scorpio was believed to ensure a harmonious relationship with the sea itself, while avoiding periods when Mars, the planet of conflict and sudden disaster, was in an unfavorable aspect with the moon. This careful timing was a critical part of their risk management, a way to placate the capricious gods of the ocean and stack the cosmic odds in their favor before they ever lost sight of land. This tradition of astrological seamanship found its most fierce and dramatic expression in the dragon-headed longships of the Vikings. To the Norsemen, the sea was not just a highway, it was the realm of the gods, a living entity filled with spirits and omens. Their navigation was a potent blend of brutal practicality and deep mythic belief. They used a crude but effective sun compass and certainly tracked the North Star, but they also lived in a world where the aurora borealis was the glittering armor of the Valkyries and a sudden squall could be the wrath of the god Aegir. Their entire raiding strategy was built around the rhythms of the heavens. They planned their infamous summer raids, their Viking, to coincide with specific lunar phases. A full moon provided essential light for a nighttime approach to a vulnerable coastline, allowing them to beach their ships and attack a sleeping monastery or village under the cover of what they might have seen as the eye of Odin himself. But the moon's influence was also deeply tied to the tides. A Viking chieftain wouldn't just set sail when the wind was fair. He would wait for the astrologically correct tidal moment, calculated to carry his fleet swiftly across the North Sea, and then, crucially, to allow for a fast retreat laden with plunder before any local defense could be organized. For them, the moon was not a distant rock. It was the celestial engine that pulled the sea, and to ignore its power was to invite catastrophic failure. This belief in celestial favor for naval engagements became formalized in the great imperial fleets of the medieval and Renaissance periods. The Spanish and Portuguese during the Age of Exploration, while pioneering incredible advances in celestial navigation, still heavily relied on astrologers to elect the perfect moment to launch their monumental voyages. The court astrologer to King Manuel I of Portugal would have been consulted before Vasco da Gama's fleet ever set sail for India, casting a chart to ensure the planets were aligned for discovery, wealth, and victory over any infidels they might encounter. They sought a time when Jupiter, the planet of expansion and good fortune, was dominant, ideally making a favorable aspect to Neptune, the planet associated with the sea. This celestial blessing was seen as vital for securing royal funding and for recruiting sailors who were, by and large, deeply superstitious and reluctant to sail into the unknown without the assurance that the universe was on their side. The captain general of a fleet carried this astrological mandate with him like a secret weapon, a source of divine confidence that he could use to maintain discipline and morale during the terrifying, months-long stretches across trackless ocean, where the only constants were the stars above and the belief that their patterns held the key to survival and unimaginable reward. In this way, astrology became the unseen admiral of the imperial navy, a silent partner in the project of empire that guided the course of history from the crow's nest of a ship, reading destiny in the endless sky. Yet the most profound impact of this celestial manipulation was not on the enemy, but on the commander's own ranks. A general who could convincingly claim the favor of the heavens was not just a leader, he was a prophet, a chosen vessel of destiny. This belief forged an unbreakable bond of loyalty between him and his men. Consider the Roman legions marching under Emperor Augustus. They didn't just follow a political leader, they followed a man whose personal horoscope was public knowledge, a man who had literally written his divine right to rule in the stars. For a common soldier, this was transformative. The fear of death in battle was overshadowed by the conviction that he was part of a cosmic plan, an agent of a fate that could not be thwarted. This psychological armor made armies incredibly resilient. They would hold a line against overwhelming odds, march further on scant supplies, and maintain discipline in the face of terror, all because they believed their victory was preordained. The stars became the ultimate morale officer, whispering promises of inevitability into the ear of every man, turning a collection of individuals into an unstoppable force united by a shared celestial destiny. This psychological warfare also had a dark, subversive edge, deployed not with swords but with whispers. A clever commander would use spies and deserters to sow astrological disinformation within the enemy camp. The goal was to infect the opposing army with a virus of doubt. Imagine the scene in a besieged city or in an enemy camp the night before a major engagement. A rumor begins to circulate, passed quietly from soldier to soldier, that a court astrologer had foreseen a great defeat, that Mars was in a weak position in their king's chart, or that a recent eclipse directly threatened their general's life. In an age where such beliefs were foundational, this was not merely gossip, it was a psychological siege engine. It could erode confidence in leadership, make soldiers hesitant to advance, and even trigger mass desertion. There are accounts from medieval conflicts of entire units refusing to fight because of a widely believed bad omen, their commanders powerless to overcome the deep-seated celestial fear. The mere threat of divine displeasure, carefully manufactured and artfully disseminated, could achieve what 1,000 cavalry charges might not: the collapse of an army's will to fight before a single blow was ever struck. The true mastery of this craft lay in its plausibility. The sky was a public theater, and its events were undeniable. A comet really did appear, an eclipse truly did darken the sun. The genius was in controlling the interpretation of these shared experiences. The most effective leaders were those who could act as the sole translators of the celestial language for their people. They created a powerful feedback loop. A military victory would be presented not as the result of superior tactics or courage, but as proof that their astrological predictions were correct. This, in turn, reinforced their authority to interpret the next sign, and the next. They built an entire cosmology of power around themselves, where every success was evidence of their divine mandate, and every setback could be explained away as a misunderstood omen, or the result of not following the celestial advice closely enough. It was a self-reinforcing system of control that elevated the ruler from a mere mortal to a crucial intermediary between the earthly and the divine, wielding the heavens themselves as the ultimate tool to command the human spirit. Yet for all its influence and imperial endorsement, the practice of celestial warfare was never without its vocal and powerful critics. Even at the height of its popularity, a persistent chorus of doubters argued from logic, experience, and theology that placing the fate of armies in the hands of the stars was not just foolish, but dangerously irresponsible. The most eloquent of these early skeptics was the Roman statesman and philosopher Cicero, who, in the 1st century BCE, penned a devastating critique titled On Divination. With the precision of a lawyer dismantling a weak case, Cicero attacked the very foundations of astrological prediction. He pointed out the obvious logical flaw. How could the same celestial configuration at birth dictate the identical fate for a slave, a king, and a beggar? He highlighted the countless failed predictions that were conveniently forgotten, while the occasional lucky guess was proclaimed as proof. For a practical Roman mind like Cicero's, the idea that the distant, impersonal motions of planets could cause events on Earth was absurd. He argued that true leadership relied on reason, strategy, and courage, qualities forged in the human spirit, not dictated by the stars. A general who trusted an astrologer over his own scouts, Cicero warned, was leading his men to ruin based on a fantasy. This philosophical skepticism was soon joined by a far more powerful force, religious condemnation. As Christianity rose to become the state religion of the Roman Empire and then the dominant faith of medieval Europe, its theologians launched a sustained assault on astrological practices. The central conflict was over free will and the omnipotence of God. Church fathers like Saint Augustine argued passionately that astrology was a form of pagan fatalism, a denial of humanity's God-given freedom to choose between good and evil. More seriously, it was seen as a challenge to divine omnipotence, suggesting that the planets rather than God controlled human destiny. This was not an abstract debate, it was heresy. Church councils issued decrees forbidding the clergy from practicing astrology, and it was increasingly associated with demonic influence and witchcraft. This created an intense dilemma for a medieval Christian king. He might personally believe in the power of the stars, and his own military advisors might swear by it, but to openly consult an astrologer risked condemnation from a powerful church that saw such practices as a direct threat to its authority. This tension forced many rulers to practice a kind of celestial diplomacy, publicly affirming their Christian faith while quietly seeking astrological counsel behind closed doors, a delicate balancing act between heaven and heaven. Beyond the halls of philosophers and theologians, the most damning critiques often came from the battlefields themselves, written in the blood of failed campaigns. History is littered with examples of astrological advice that led to catastrophe. There's the famous, though likely apocryphal, story of the Greek general Nicias during the Sicilian expedition in 413 BCE. The Athenian fleet was poised to make a critical retreat under cover of darkness when a lunar eclipse occurred. Nicias, deeply superstitious, interpreted this as a terrible omen and consulted his soothsayers, who advised him to wait for the next full moon, a delay of 27 days. This decision proved fatal. The Athenian forces were trapped and utterly destroyed by the Syracusans, a catastrophic defeat from which Athens never fully recovered. Whether entirely accurate or not, the story of Nicias became a cautionary tale repeated for centuries by military commanders who argued that blind faith in omens could paralyze an army and hand victory to a more pragmatic enemy. These real-world failures provided skeptics with their most powerful ammunition, tangible proof that when the celestial maps failed to match the terrain on the ground, the result was not just embarrassment but annihilation. This fundamental divide often created a palpable tension within military command structures, pitting the astrologer advisor against the practical, battle-hardened general. The astrologer, often a scholar or priest who had never held a sword, spoke in the complex language of planetary aspects and lunar mansions. The general, whose life depended on understanding the immediate realities of supply lines, troop morale, and enemy positions, often preferred hard intelligence. There are accounts from multiple empires of generals deliberately ignoring astrological advice they deemed risky or irrelevant, trusting their own instincts and experience instead. A Roman legate might be told that Mars was in detriment and that he should avoid battle, but if he saw the enemy army disorganized and vulnerable across the field, he would give the order to attack. A successful outcome in such a scenario would powerfully reinforce the value of empirical command over celestial dogma. This internal conflict between faith and reason, between the cosmic and the practical, was a constant undercurrent in military planning, a silent war room debate that has echoed through history whenever humanity has tried to find certainty in an uncertain world, proving that the challenge of leadership has always involved knowing which signs to read and which to ignore. While Roman generals consulted their personal astrologers and Islamic scholars refined their celestial charts, on the other side of the world, entirely separate empires were developing their own profound and intricate systems for reading the heavens in times of war. This parallel development is perhaps one of the most compelling testaments to the universal human desire to find cosmic order in the chaos of conflict. In ancient China, astrology was not a mystical side project. It was a central pillar of statecraft, bureaucratized and integrated into the very machinery of imperial government. The Chinese worldview was built on the concept of the mandate of heaven, the idea that a ruler's right to govern was granted by the celestial powers above. Maintaining that mandate required constant vigilance and alignment with the cosmos. To manage this, Chinese emperors established official astrological bureaus, entire government departments staffed with highly educated court astronomers and astrologers whose sole job was to observe the sky, interpret its signs, and advise the throne on all matters of state, especially warfare. The work of these bureaus was meticulous and continuous. They maintained detailed records of celestial events for centuries, noting every eclipse, comet, planetary conjunction, and sunspot. Their primary concern was detecting and understanding any form of Tianbian, or heavenly anomaly. A sudden eclipse was not just an omen, it was a direct critique from heaven, a warning that the emperor's policies were out of harmony with the universe and that his mandate was in jeopardy. This made the timing of any military action absolutely critical. Before launching a campaign, the emperor would demand a full astrological report. The court astrologers would calculate the most auspicious day and even the most favorable hour for the army to depart, ensuring the venture began under a harmonious celestial configuration. They paid particular attention to the position of the planet Mars, which they associated with war, fire, and aggression, calling it the fire star or Yin Huo. If Mars was seen moving in a retrograde path or coming too close to certain key stars, it could be interpreted as a sign of impending rebellion, invasion, or defeat, causing the emperor to delay an attack or strengthen his defenses. This system was so formalized that a general who marched without this celestial approval could be seen as not just disobedient, but as threatening the cosmic balance of the entire empire. Meanwhile, on the Indian subcontinent, a different but equally sophisticated tradition was flourishing. Vedic astrology, known as Jyotish or the science of light, was considered one of the most vital fields of knowledge, a necessary component for any wise ruler. Its military applications were extensively detailed in ancient strategic manuals, the most famous being Kautilya's Arthashastra, a comprehensive treatise on statecraft, economic policy, and military strategy written around the 3rd century BCE. For a strategic mastermind like Kautilya, the advisor to the first Mauryan emperor Chandragupta Maurya, astrology was a practical tool for reducing uncertainty. The Arthashastra explicitly advises the king to consult his court astrologers, or Jyotishis, before any major military undertaking. The text outlines how to interpret a vast array of celestial omens, from the shapes of clouds and the direction of winds to the more traditional movements of planets and stars. Indian military astrology developed incredibly nuanced systems that were, in some ways, even more complex than their Western counterparts. A key concept was the use of nakshatras, or lunar mansions, 27 distinct sectors along the moon's path through the sky. Each nakshatra had its own unique qualities, deities, and associations. A king and his astrologer would carefully choose which nakshatra the moon was passing through for the launch of a campaign. Launching under the nakshatra of Rohini, associated with growth and stability, was considered highly favorable for a long, sustained campaign. In contrast, initiating combat under Mula, a nakshatra linked to radical change and destruction, was seen as extremely risky, potentially leading to the utter ruin of both sides. Beyond the nakshatras, they also used dashas, complex planetary periods that mapped out the long-term cycles of influence in a king's life, and, by extension, his kingdom. A king entering a period ruled by a weak or afflicted planet might be advised to adopt a defensive military posture, while one in a strong Mars or Sun period might be encouraged to expand his territories aggressively. This wasn't a simple matter of good days and bad days. It was a deeply holistic approach to timing that wove together astronomy, mythology, and psychology into a comprehensive strategic framework. The fascinating element here is the independent yet parallel development of these ideas. The Chinese system, with its state-run bureaus and focus on heavenly mandate, emerged from a philosophy of centralized imperial control and cosmological harmony. The Indian system, with its emphasis on lunar mansions and planetary periods, grew from the ancient Vedic spiritual traditions. They had no direct contact with the Roman or Hellenistic astrological traditions, yet they arrived at the same fundamental conclusion. The cosmos is a readable text, and its patterns hold vital intelligence for the commander who knows how to interpret it. From the Forbidden City in Beijing to the palaces of Patalapatra in India, rulers looked to the same sky for the same reason: to weaponize its perceived order in their relentless pursuit of victory. This global phenomenon shatters any notion that celestial warfare was a quirky footnote in Western history. It was, in fact, a near-universal principle of ancient power, a testament to a time when the battlefield was seen not just as a plot of Earth, but as a reflection of the entire universe. Yet for all its enduring power across empires and centuries, the celestial guidance that once dictated the movements of armies could not forever withstand the relentless tide of a new way of thinking. The unshakable belief that the heavens controlled human destiny began to fracture under the weight of observation, reason, and a series of intellectual revolutions that would redefine humanity's place in the universe. The decline was not a sudden collapse but a slow, grinding retreat, a rearguard action fought against the advancing forces of empiricism and science. It started with a fundamental shift in perspective, one that removed Earth from the center of the cosmic drama. When Nicolaus Copernicus proposed his heliocentric model in the 16th century, he didn't just reposition the planets, he delivered a devastating blow to the entire philosophical underpinning of astrology. If Earth was not the immovable center of God's creation around which all else revolved, then how could the motions of other planets hold specific, personal meaning for its inhabitants? The cosmos suddenly became vast, impersonal, and mechanically predictable, a clockwork universe that operated by immutable physical laws rather than by sending personalized messages to kings and generals. This new cosmic model found its most powerful champions in figures like Galileo Galilei and Isaac Newton. Galileo, peering through his telescope, saw not the perfect, unchanging celestial spheres of Aristotle, but a moon with craters, sunspots that marred the face of the sun, and moons orbiting Jupiter. The heavens were not a realm of divine perfection. They were a physical place subject to the same forces and imperfections as Earth. This desanctification of the sky stripped it of its mystical power. Then came Newton, who in the late 17th century provided the mathematical laws that governed the motion of every object in the universe, from a falling apple to the orbit of Mars. His law of universal gravitation showed that planetary motion was not guided by capricious divine will but by predictable, calculable forces. For military planners, this was a watershed moment. Why consult an astrologer to guess at the influence of Mars when a physicist could calculate its exact position with pinpoint accuracy for centuries to come? The mystery was being replaced by mathematics, and the astrologer's art began to look like mere superstition in the harsh light of rational inquiry. On the battlefields of Europe, a parallel revolution was underway, one that valued human discipline over divine favor. The 30 Years' War in the 17th century became a brutal laboratory for new military doctrines. Commanders like Sweden's Gustavus Adolphus revolutionized warfare not by reading the stars, but by implementing rigorous drill, standardized weaponry, and linear tactics that emphasized volley fire and coordinated movement. His success was not attributed to a favorable alignment of Jupiter and Mars, but to his innovative use of combined arms and his ability to mobilize and supply his armies more effectively than his opponents. Victory was now seen as the product of superior training, logistics, and tactical genius factors that were within human control. The role of the military leader transformed from that of a divine intermediary who waited for a celestial sign into that of a master administrator and engineer who could shape his own fate through planning and precision. The army itself became a machine, and its efficiency, not the favor of the planets, determined its success. By the time of the Enlightenment in the 18th century, astrology had been thoroughly ejected from the halls of power and the command tents of Europe's great generals. It became a subject of ridicule among the intellectual elite, a relic of a credulous and backward age. The famous French philosopher Voltaire savagely mocked astrologers, writing that it was charmingly absurd that the instant of a man's birth could influence his entire life and that the stars, millions of miles away, could possibly care about his petty affairs. In this new age of reason, to base a military campaign on such ideas was not just old-fashioned. It was a mark of incompetence and foolishness. Military academies now taught geometry, fortification, and ballistics, not the interpretation of planetary aspects. The officer corps was filled with men who believed in progress, science, and the power of human reason to overcome any obstacle. And yet, even as it was banished from official doctrine, the old belief in signs and portents never completely vanished from the ranks. It simply retreated into the folk traditions and superstitions of the common soldier. Throughout the 18th and 19th centuries, there are countless accounts of soldiers looking for omens before a battle. A lucky coin, a dream, or the sudden appearance of a bird could be invested with immense significance. The fear of an eclipse or a comet might still ripple through a camp, a faint echo of the terror that once halted ancient armies. This persistence reveals a profound truth about the human condition in the face of war. No amount of rational training could entirely erase the deep-seated fear and uncertainty that comes with combat. When facing the chaos and randomness of the battlefield, where a single cannonball could end a life in an instant, soldiers, and sometimes even their enlightened officers, would still grasp for any sign of hope, any indication that fate might be on their side. The language of the stars had been silenced in the war room, but its whisper could still be heard in the trenches, a timeless testament to our need to find meaning and reassurance when staring into the abyss. While the polished brass of modern military academies no longer teaches the art of reading planetary aspects, the ghost of celestial warfare still haunts the corridors of power and the minds of those who serve. This legacy isn't found in official doctrine but in the deeply ingrained language, the unofficial rituals, and the psychological underpinnings of a life lived in the shadow of conflict. Consider the very words we use. When we call a plan or a person lunatic, we are unconsciously invoking a centuries-old belief directly tied to military astrology, the idea that the phases of the moon could influence human sanity and behavior. Ancient commanders feared sending troops into battle under a full moon, worried it would make them irrational and unpredictable. That specific superstition may have faded, but the linguistic fossil remains, a permanent echo of a time when the moon was seen as an active participant in warfare, capable of swaying the morale and mental state of an entire army. This persistence of belief reveals a fundamental truth about the human psyche in extreme situations. In the high-stress, high-stakes environment of combat, where control is an illusion and chaos reigns, soldiers and commanders alike will grasp for any semblance of order or predictability. This is where informal superstitions thrive, creating a modern folklore that serves the same psychological purpose as ancient astrological consultation. A soldier might carry a lucky charm, a unit might uphold a bizarre pre-mission ritual, or a pilot might insist on wearing a specific pair of socks for every sortie. These practices are not rational, but they are profoundly human. They are a way to manage the overwhelming anxiety of the unknown, to create a personal sense of control where none objectively exists. In this sense, the modern infantryman rubbing a lucky coin is a direct descendant of the Roman legionary who took comfort in his emperor's promise of celestial favor. The technology has changed beyond recognition, but the fundamental need for psychological armor has not. Perhaps the most compelling modern parallel lies not in superstition, but in strategy. Some contemporary military theorists and historians draw a fascinating analogy between the ancient astrologers' search for auspicious timing and the modern commander's reliance on data-driven decision-making. Both are, at their core, attempts to reduce the crippling uncertainty of war by imposing a system of prediction. The astrologer used complex charts and planetary tables to identify a moment of perceived advantage. Today, a military operations center uses vast amounts of intelligence, surveillance, reconnaissance data, weather reports, and predictive algorithms to achieve the exact same goal: to find the optimal time and place to strike. The tool has shifted from an ephemeris to a computer model, but the underlying desire is identical: to see through the fog of war and make the unpredictable seem predictable. We have replaced faith in the stars with faith in data, but the quest to find patterns and leverage them for victory connects the drone pilot to the horoscopes. This evolution highlights a continuous thread in the history of conflict: the management of morale. Ancient generals used astrological propaganda to inspire unshakable confidence in their troops, to make them feel like instruments of destiny. Modern military psychology achieves the same end through different means. Unit cohesion, belief in the mission, and trust in leadership are now carefully cultivated through training, branding, and communication. A special forces unit with a distinctive insignia and a storied history is being given a modern version of a celestial mandate. They are made to believe they are part of something elite and destined for success. The method is more scientific, but the intended effect on the human spirit is precisely the same. It is the understanding that the most powerful weapon in any arsenal is not the smartest bomb or the most advanced tank, but the convinced mind of the person who wields it. The battlefield is, and always has been, a psychological space where belief can be the difference between retreat and victory. Ultimately, the story of astrology in warfare is not a story about the stars. It is a story about us. It is a testament to the timeless human yearning to find order in chaos, meaning in randomness, and reassurance in the face of overwhelming fear. The methods have evolved from reading celestial omens to running complex computer simulations, but the core impulse remains constant. We still look for signs, we still create rituals, and we still seek any possible edge to reduce the terrifying uncertainty of conflict. The heavens are no longer seen as a divine battle map, but the human need to feel that the universe is on our side, in some small way, endures. This legacy reminds us that while our tools become more sophisticated, the fundamental challenges of courage, leadership, and morale in the crucible of war are eternal, connecting the general of today to the emperor who once looked to the sky for a sign. Beyond the tactical advice whispered in the command tent, the true genius of imperial astrology lay in its power to craft a public story, to weave a narrative of destiny so compelling that it could cement a ruler's legitimacy and justify his most ambitious actions. This was the realm of celestial propaganda, where the language of the stars was translated into a powerful tool of mass persuasion, designed to convince both the populace and potential rivals that a leader's authority was not merely earned, but preordained by the cosmos itself. Emperors understood that controlling the physical battlefield was only half the victory. The other half was won in the minds of their subjects, and for that, they needed a story that was larger than life, written in the one text everyone could see but few could read, the night sky. By claiming a special connection to the celestial order, a ruler could present himself as the indispensable link between heaven and earth, the sole interpreter of divine will whose commands were not to be questioned. The Roman emperors, masters of political theater, perfected this art. Nero, a man obsessed with his public image and perpetually paranoid about threats to his power, surrounded himself with a coterie of court astrologers. Their primary role was less about predicting the future and more about manufacturing a present that glorified his reign. After the Great Fire of Rome in 64 AD, which rumors accused Nero of starting, he faced widespread public fury. His response was a masterclass in astrological deflection. His advisors crafted a new narrative, linking his birth chart to a famous conjunction of planets that had occurred years earlier, which they now reinterpreted as a sign of a great purifying fire that would clear the way for a glorious rebirth under his leadership. He even used this cosmic justification to seize vast tracts of land from the ruined city center to build his extravagant Domus Aurea, or Golden House, presenting this act of monumental vanity as a fulfillment of celestial destiny. The stars, in his telling, had not just predicted the fire, they had demanded it, and he was merely the agent of their grand design, a narrative intended to transform a potential political catastrophe into a divinely sanctioned urban renewal project. This manipulation took on a far more sinister tone under Emperor Domitian, a ruler known for his suspicion and brutality. Domitian lived in constant fear of conspiracy. He became notoriously dependent on his court astrologer, a man named Ascletario. Rather than seeking genuine guidance, Domitian used astrology as a pretext for his purges. If an astrological reading suggested a threat from a man of a certain description, perhaps someone born under a specific configuration of planets, Domitian would use this as justification to eliminate political enemies or wealthy citizens whose property he coveted. The celestial pronouncement became a death warrant, a seemingly objective, divine reason for actions that were, in reality, driven by paranoia and greed. In this way, astrology was weaponized as a tool of state terror, its language of fate and inevitability providing a cold, impersonal justification for murder, making the emperor's will indistinguishable from the will of the gods themselves. But the most brilliant and enduring propaganda was not spoken. It was minted and carved, broadcast to the farthest corners of the empire on the currency people used every day and the monuments that dominated their cityscapes. Coins were the mass media of the ancient world, and emperors meticulously chose their imagery to send a clear, unifying message. Augustus set the standard. He flooded the empire with coins depicting his birth sign, Capricorn. This was not a casual nod to his horoscope, it was a calculated political statement. Capricorn was associated with the stern, disciplined god Saturn, but also with golden ages and renewed prosperity. By linking his identity to this symbol, Augustus was telling a story of a savior, a man destined by the stars to end a century of civil war and usher in a new era of peace and abundance. Every transaction, from a senator purchasing an estate to a soldier buying his lunch, reinforced this idea, embedding the emperor's celestial mandate into the very fabric of daily economic life. This celestial branding extended to grand architecture. The famous Aura Passes, or Altar of Peace, commissioned by Augustus, is a masterpiece of political propaganda carved in marble. Its elaborate reliefs are filled with symbolism, but the most telling panel is the one believed to depict the goddess Tellus, or Mother Earth, surrounded by symbols of fertility and prosperity. Flanking her are the personified winds, and above, the sky is represented by the figure of the celestial dome. The entire scene is a visual representation of the Pax Augusta, the Augustan peace, portraying it as a state of perfect harmony between earth, sky, and water, a harmony that existed solely because the emperor, himself a figure ordained by the heavens, was in charge. A citizen viewing this altar would internalize the message. The stability and safety they enjoyed were not the result of political maneuvering or military might, but a direct consequence of the natural order, which had chosen Augustus as its guardian. The message was clear: to oppose him was not just treasonous, it was to disrupt the fundamental balance of the universe, a thought as unthinkable as opposing the changing of the seasons. Through this sophisticated fusion of cosmic imagery and political power, emperors did not just rule their empires, they authored their own myths, transforming themselves from mortal men into living legends whose authority was as fixed and eternal as the stars themselves. Yet within the rigidly patriarchal structures of ancient empires, where power was almost exclusively a male domain, a fascinating and often hidden history unfolds, one where women, through their mastery of the celestial arts, carved out a unique and influential space in the highest echelons of military strategy. The story of military astrology is not just a chronicle of emperors and generals. It is also the story of the formidable women who advised them, women who leveraged their perceived connection to the divine to sway the fate of nations from the shadows of the throne room. Operating outside the traditional pathways to power, these seers, prophetesses, and learned matrons became indispensable counselors. Their authority derived not from birthright or martial prowess, but from an expertise that was considered both terrifying and essential. Their presence adds a crucial and often overlooked layer to our understanding of how imperial power truly functioned, revealing a world where strategic insight could come from the most unexpected of voices. One of the most striking examples comes from the Severan dynasty of Rome in the early 3rd century, a period of immense military upheaval and imperial expansion. At the heart of this power structure was Julia Soaemias, the niece of the Emperor Septimius Severus and mother of the infamous Emperor Elagabalus. While the historical record often focuses on the scandalous personal life of her son, it largely obscures Julia's own formidable political acumen, which was deeply intertwined with her role as a priestess and astrological patron. She was a high priestess of the sun god Elagabal in her native Emesa in modern-day Syria, a role that granted her immense religious authority and a profound understanding of celestial law. When her family plotted to place her young son on the imperial throne in opposition to the reigning Emperor Macrinus, it was almost certainly Julia and her mother, Julia Misa, who orchestrated the astrological propaganda that made the coup possible. They promoted the story that Elagabalus was the illegitimate son of the previous emperor, Caracalla, a claim they bolstered with carefully selected celestial signs and portents designed to convince the powerful legions of the East that the boy was the true heir chosen by the gods. Her influence did not end with his accession. As the power behind the throne, she would have continued to interpret celestial events to guide state policy and military deployments, using her religious and astrological authority to legitimize her family's fragile grip on power in a time of perpetual civil war. Julia Soaemias represents the pinnacle of this female influence, a woman who operated at the very nexus of religion, astrology, and military politics, using her unique expertise to shape the course of the Roman Empire itself. Beyond the glittering courts of Rome, the influence of women in military astrology took on a different, more grassroots form across the medieval world. In villages and towns, the local, wise woman or cunning folk often served as the community's first resort for divination and omens. While their purview typically included healing, love charms, and finding lost objects, their skills were also sought for matters of conflict. A local lord preparing to lead his men into a border skirmish might discreetly consult the village seer to read the flight patterns of birds or interpret a disturbing dream, seeking a sign of whether the venture would succeed. These women possessed a deep, folkloric knowledge of the natural world and the heavens, passed down through generations outside the formal, male-dominated scholarly tradition. Their advice, though rooted in a different kind of knowledge than the complex mathematical astrology of court scholars, was no less influential at a local level. It provided a crucial psychological framework for men about to face the terror of battle, offering either a much-needed boost of confidence or a warning to avoid a futile fight. In this way, these women served as the astrological advisors for the common soldier and the minor nobility, their wisdom woven into the very fabric of military life at the grassroots level, proving that the celestial guidance of armies was not always a top-down affair, but could also bubble up from the knowledge held and respected within a community. The path for these women, however, was fraught with danger and duality. Their power was entirely contingent on their perceived authenticity as conduits of divine knowledge. This placed them in a precarious position. They were simultaneously revered and feared, indispensable and vulnerable. A successful prediction could elevate a prophetess to unparalleled heights of influence, as it did for the Sibyls of the ancient world, whose cryptic writings were consulted by Roman senators before declaring war. However, a failed prediction or a shift in the political winds could be catastrophic. A woman who had fallen out of favor could easily be dismissed as a fraud or, even worse, accused of witchcraft or treason charges that often carried a death sentence. This constant risk meant that female astrologers had to be not only intellectually sharp but also politically astute, navigating the treacherous currents of the court with immense care. Their authority was a fragile thing, built on the shifting sands of belief and perception, and it could be shattered in an instant by a displeased emperor or a rival advisor. Their story is thus one of remarkable resilience and intelligence, a testament to the ways in which women have always found avenues to exert influence, even within systems designed to exclude them, by mastering a language of power that everyone, from the lowest soldier to the emperor himself, believed in. Behind every general who gazed at the stars for guidance stood a library of knowledge, a collection of meticulously crafted texts that transformed celestial observation into a formal art of war. These were not dusty scrolls of vague prophecies, but precise technical manuals, the ancient equivalent of modern field manuals or strategic doctrine, providing military advisors with a step-by-step framework for interpreting the cosmos. The most influential of these foundational works was Claudius Ptolemy's Tetrabiblos, written in the 2nd century AD in the intellectual hub of Alexandria. While Ptolemy is more famous for the Almagest, his astronomical masterpiece that mapped the motions of the heavens, the Tetrabiblos was its practical counterpart, the user's guide for applying that celestial mechanics to human affairs. Within its 4 books, Ptolemy dedicated significant portions to matters of state and conflict, creating a systematic method for what he termed mundane astrology. He provided clear rules for predicting the outbreak of wars, the nature of the combatants, and even the likely outcomes of battles based on planetary cycles and the astrological charts of nations and their rulers. For instance, he taught that the conjunctions of the slower, more powerful planets like Jupiter and Saturn were indicators of grand, epoch-changing events, the rise and fall of dynasties, major plagues, or long, drawn-out wars. A military advisor in Rome or Constantinople would consult these principles to advise his emperor on whether the celestial climate favored expansion or demanded a defensive posture, turning abstract planetary movements into concrete strategic intelligence. Centuries later and a world away, this Greco-Roman knowledge was preserved, refined, and massively expanded by Islamic scholars during the Golden Age of Islam. In the great translation houses of Baghdad, works like the Tetrabiblos were not merely copied. They were critically studied, corrected using more advanced astronomical observations, and fused with Persian and Indian astrological traditions. The most monumental figure in this effort was the 9th century Persian scholar Abu Mashar, known in the West as Albumassar. His massive work, The Great Introduction to the Science of the Stars, became the definitive astrological textbook for centuries, circulating throughout Europe, the Middle East, and North Africa. Albumassar's writings on military astrology were breathtakingly detailed. He developed complex systems for timing military actions based on the phases of the moon and its passage through the zodiac, believing that certain signs were more favorable for initiating attacks, laying sieges, or even negotiating treaties. His work offered a veritable checklist for commanders. If you want to ambush an enemy, do it when the moon is in a fiery sign like Aries or Sagittarius. If you need to fortify a position or build siege engines, choose a time when the moon is in an earth sign like Taurus or Virgo for stability and durability. These texts were not philosophical musings. They were practical, action-oriented guides that provided a celestial timetable for every conceivable aspect of warfare, giving commanders a sense of control over the chaotic and unpredictable nature of armed conflict. The survival and transmission of these manuals across millennia and cultures is a story of scholarly dedication that itself altered the course of history. As the Roman Empire in the West crumbled, it was often monastic scribes in isolated European monasteries who painstakingly preserved fragments of classical astrological knowledge, copying them onto parchment alongside religious texts. But the true lifeline was the Islamic world, where caliphs invested vast resources in acquiring and translating knowledge from every corner of their empire and beyond. Greek texts were translated into Syriac, then into Arabic, and often later from Arabic into Latin and Hebrew, each translation adding new layers of commentary and insight. This created a continuous thread of learning that stretched from the libraries of Alexandria to the scriptoria of Spain and the rising universities of medieval Europe. A military advisor to a Norman king like William the Conqueror might have relied on a Latin translation of an Arabic commentary on a Greek original, a truly globalized body of knowledge. These texts became prized possessions, symbols of a ruler's sophistication and access to powerful, esoteric wisdom. They were often lavishly illustrated with intricate diagrams of the heavens and zodiacal symbols, making them not just tools of war but also objects of immense cultural and artistic value, physical testaments to the enduring human belief that the secret to victory on earth could be found in the perfect order of the sky above. This collision of faiths, known to history as the Crusades, is often portrayed as a pure clash of civilizations, a binary struggle between Christianity and Islam. But if we listen closely to the historical whispers, we hear another, more universal language being spoken in both camps. The language of the stars. Far from being a sideshow, astrology provided a shared strategic framework for both Crusader and Saracen, a surprising common ground in a conflict defined by its religious absolutism. The armies that met under the blistering sun of the Holy Land may have prayed to different gods, but they looked to the very same heavens for a sign of who would prevail. This celestial dialogue turned the Crusades into one of history's most fascinating case studies for the weaponization of astrology, proving that when survival is at stake, even the bitterest of enemies will consult the same cosmic playbook. For the European knights who answered Pope Urban II's call to liberate Jerusalem, the journey east was a voyage into the unknown, a terrifying leap of faith across a world they did not understand. In this state of profound uncertainty, celestial omens became a crucial source of reassurance and divine confirmation. The chronicles of the First Crusade are filled with these moments. As the weary, desperate Crusader armies finally closed in on Jerusalem in the summer of 1099, a brilliant comet appeared in the night sky. To the men besieging the holy city, this was not a random astronomical event. It was a blazing sword of God, a clear and undeniable signal that their cause was righteous and their victory assured. This interpretation, fervently promoted by priests and lords alike, electrified the Christian camp. The morale of the soldiers, which had been frayed by years of hardship, disease, and internal squabbling, was instantly restored. They attacked the city's formidable walls with a renewed fury born of celestial certainty, convinced that the heavens themselves were commanding them to break through. The eventual capture of Jerusalem was, in their minds, a fulfillment of this divine promise written in the stars, a testament that God was guiding their every move through the medium of the night sky. Yet across the battlements within the besieged city, the Muslim defenders were engaged in the exact same practice, reading the same cosmos for a very different message. The Islamic world of the late 11th century was the undisputed center of advanced astrological science. The courts of Seljuk Turkish emirs and Fatimid caliphs employed the most brilliant minds of the age scholars who had preserved and greatly expanded upon the astrological knowledge of the Greeks and Persians. For these Muslim rulers, consulting the Manajman, or astrologers, before any major military decision was standard procedure. As the Crusaders tightened their siege, the defenders would have certainly been consulting their own astrological readings. They would have been scrutinizing the position of Mars, analyzing the moon's phases for clues about the best time to sortie out from the gates or mount a counterattack, and interpreting any unusual celestial events. A comet like the one that so encouraged the Crusaders might have been read by the Muslim astrologers in a completely different light, perhaps as a portent of great change and upheaval, but not necessarily of their defeat. This creates a stunning picture: two armies locked in a holy war, each looking up at the same starry night, each receiving a message of victory from their own interpreters of the celestial text. The sky became a mirror, each side seeing their own faith and fate reflected back at them. This mutual engagement created moments of strange, unintended synchronization, where both sides were dancing to the same cosmic rhythm. There are accounts from later crusades of both Frankish and Muslim armies suddenly breaking off engagements or delaying planned attacks. The reasons recorded are often vague: the signs were not favorable, or the time was not right. It is highly plausible that these simultaneous pauses were the result of both sides' astrologers independently arriving at the same conclusion based on the planetary configurations overhead. A negative aspect between Mars and Saturn, for instance, might have been read by advisors on both sides as a terrible time to commit to a full-scale battle, leading to a spontaneous and unspoken truce dictated not by generals but by the planets. In this sense, astrology acted as an unconscious moderator of the conflict, a shared belief system that occasionally overrode religious animosity to impose a period of cautious calm. It was a form of communication that transcended language barriers and religious polemics, a silent agreement written in a language both sides respected, even if they decoded its meanings differently. The ultimate testament to astrology's power in this era was its ability to cross enemy lines and be adopted by the other side. The longer the Frankish crusaders stayed in the Levant, establishing their kingdoms and interacting with the sophisticated cultures they had come to conquer, the more they began to absorb local customs and knowledge, including astrology. Initially, the church authorities in the Crusader states railed against the practice, seeing it as a pagan and Islamic art, but its utility was simply too compelling to ignore. By the time of the Third Crusade, we see figures like Richard the Lionheart, the archetypal Christian Night King, actively engaging with this form of strategic intelligence. While there's no evidence he had a personal court astrologer, he operated in a strategic environment where astrological intelligence was a factor. He would have been acutely aware that his formidable opponent, the Sultan Salah ad-Din, or Saladin, relied heavily on the advice of his own team of scholars and astrologers. Understanding that Saladin might delay an attack or move his troops based on celestial advice would have been a crucial piece of military intelligence for Richard. He wasn't necessarily reading the stars himself, but he was forced to learn the language to anticipate the moves of a man who did. This cultural seepage shows that after a century of conflict, the Crusaders had begun to understand that to defeat their enemy, they had to first understand how he thought, and a central part of that worldview was written in the stars. The heavens, in the end, became not just a weapon but a bridge. Of all the brutal, grinding forms of ancient combat, perhaps none was more dependent on timing than a siege. Unlike the fluid chaos of an open field battle, a siege was a slow, methodical, and incredibly expensive affair. An army could spend months, even years, camped outside a city's walls, slowly starving the inhabitants while attempting to breach their formidable defenses. In this high-stakes waiting game, where a single misstep could lead to catastrophic losses or the complete failure of a campaign, commanders left very little to chance. And for many, that meant consulting the ultimate strategic clock, the movement of the planets. The decision of when to finally storm the walls, when to launch a desperate sortie, or when to expect a relieving force was not merely a matter of counting supplies or assessing the enemy's morale. It was a celestial calculation, a carefully chosen moment believed to be imbued with the favor of the cosmos itself, turning the entire operation into a ritual as much as a military engagement. This fusion of the practical and the spiritual was never more evident than in the deployment of complex siege engines. These massive machines of war, trebuchets that could hurl stones weighing hundreds of pounds, battering rams designed to splinter reinforced gates, and mobile siege towers that allowed attackers to scale walls, represented the pinnacle of medieval military engineering. Their construction was a marvel of logistics and craftsmanship, yet their first deployment was almost never immediate. A commander would often have his astrologer determine the most auspicious day and hour to unleash their power. The reasoning was both psychological and metaphysical. Launching the first stone from a trebuchet under a favorable planetary alignment, perhaps with Mars strong and angular in the chart, was believed to do more than just physical damage. It was thought to infuse the attack with a divine momentum, to spiritually weaken the resolve of the defenders who witnessed this awesome force being unleashed in apparent harmony with the universe. The roar of the engine and the impact of the stone were not just sounds of war, they were the sound of celestial will being made manifest, a psychological blow that could be as devastating as the physical destruction. This celestial timing extended to the most secretive and dangerous aspect of siegecraft, mining. The practice of digging tunnels or saps underneath a city's walls to collapse them or to infiltrate soldiers was a desperate gamble. It was dark, claustrophobic work, fraught with the risk of tunnel collapse, counter-mining by the defenders, and suffocation, before a team of sappers or miners would even begin their treacherous dig. An astrologer would be consulted. He wouldn't just pick a random day, he would search for a time when the earth signs Taurus, Virgo, and Capricorn were dominant, believing this would grant stability to the tunnel and reduce the risk of a cave-in. Furthermore, he would avoid times when the moon was in a water sign like Cancer, Scorpio, or Pisces, fearing this celestial influence could lead to underground flooding or dangerously soggy, unstable soil. This wasn't mere superstition to the men with shovels. It was a critical risk assessment protocol. Being told the stars were favorable for their mission provided a much-needed boost of courage for those about to descend into the terrifying darkness, believing that the earth itself, guided by the heavens, would be more accommodating to their efforts. The ultimate test of this astrological strategy came during the long, brutal conflicts of the 100 Years' War, where the fate of kingdoms often hinged on the capture of key fortified towns. Commanders like the English Black Prince were renowned for their tactical brilliance, but they also understood the importance of morale and divine sanction. There are accounts of sieges being prolonged not because of a lack of supplies or military advantage, but because the commanding general was waiting for his astrologer to confirm the optimal celestial window for a final assault. To a modern mind, this seems like a dangerous hesitation, but to a medieval commander, it was the height of strategic prudence. Attacking a heavily fortified position was already a tremendously costly endeavor in terms of human life. Why would one not wait to stack every possible advantage, both material and spiritual, in their favor? A failed assault could shatter an army's spirit and use up precious resources. By waiting for a moment deemed astrologically perfect, the commander could address his troops with absolute confidence, assuring them that victory was not just possible but ordained. This conviction could turn a risky attack into a seemingly inevitable triumph, demonstrating that in the patient, calculated world of the siege, the most powerful weapon was sometimes not a machine of war, but a well-timed prediction from a stargazer. But this celestial guidance system, for all its perceived advantages, raised profound and unsettling ethical questions that echo through history, forcing us to confront the very nature of responsibility in the fog of war. Imagine a general who leads his army into a devastating, avoidable defeat. When called to account for the catastrophic loss of life, he offers a simple, unassailable defense. The stars told me to do it. This was the central moral dilemma of celestial warfare. By attributing command decisions to the impersonal will of the cosmos, a leader could effectively absolve himself of personal accountability for failure. The decision was no longer a flawed human judgment. It was the inscrutable decree of fate, a verdict from the gods that no mortal could be expected to second-guess. This created a dangerous loophole for incompetence and recklessness, allowing failed commanders to shield themselves behind a veil of divine necessity, leaving the common soldiers who paid the ultimate price with no one to hold responsible but the silent, distant planets. This potential for fatalism was a primary concern for ancient critics. The Roman statesman Cicero, ever the rationalist, attacked this very point. He argued that if astrological fate controlled everything, then human effort, courage, and strategic genius were rendered meaningless. Why drill troops? Why fortify a camp? Why plan a supply line if the outcome was already written in the stars? This line of thinking, he warned, could paralyze an army, encouraging a passive acceptance of events rather than the vigorous, proactive leadership that victory demanded. A commander waiting for a perfect celestial alignment might miss a crucial, fleeting tactical opportunity that his own eyes and experience could have seized. The reliance on cosmic signs risked replacing martial virtue with superstitious passivity, creating a culture where looking up at the sky was valued more than looking out at the actual battlefield and the real condition of the men who had to fight on it. Yet for its proponents, this was a profound misreading of their purpose. They did not see astrology as a replacement for command, but as its essential enhancement. The wise commander, in their view, was not a fatalist blindly obeying the stars. He was a collaborator with the divine will. The celestial chart was not a rigid script but a weather forecast of cosmic conditions. You wouldn't sail into a hurricane if you could avoid it, and you wouldn't launch a major military campaign under a violently discordant astrological configuration. Using this knowledge was the height of prudence, a way to align human ambition with the natural rhythms of the universe to maximize the chance of success and minimize bloodshed. In this framework, the astrologer was akin to a modern intelligence officer providing a risk assessment. The general still had to make the final call, still had to lead the charge, and still bore the responsibility for the outcome. The stars provided the context, but human courage and skill determined the result. This ancient debate finds a startlingly clear parallel in our own time with the rise of predictive technologies in modern warfare. Today, commanders don't consult astrologers. They rely on complex algorithms, vast data analytics, and artificial intelligence to forecast enemy movements, assess mission success probability, and even automate certain combat decisions. And the ethical questions are hauntingly familiar. If an autonomous drone strike based on a flawed algorithm kills civilians, who is responsible? The programmer, the commanding officer, the algorithm itself. Just like the ancient general blaming the stars, there is a risk that over-reliance on data can create a moral buffer, a diffusion of accountability where the system said to do it becomes the 21st century equivalent of the stars dictated it. We are once again grappling with the same core tension between leveraging predictive tools for advantage and surrendering our essential human judgment to a seemingly objective external system. The ethical dimension of celestial warfare ultimately forces us to ask what we truly expect from our leaders, both then and now. Is the ideal commander a master of logistics and tactics alone, or is he also a steward of the human spirit, responsible for the morale and moral certainty of his troops? The proponents of astrology argued that by providing a narrative of divine favor and cosmic destiny, they were fulfilling this deeper duty, forging an army that believed itself invincible. The critics saw this as a dangerous manipulation that undermined the very foundations of personal accountability. This historical struggle reminds us that the quest for certainty in the chaos of war is eternal, and the tools we use, whether star charts or computer models, are never neutral. They come loaded with profound moral implications about free will, responsibility, and the price of surrendering our decisions to a higher, or at least a more calculated, power. While the emperors of Rome and the caliphs of Baghdad were consulting their court astrologers in marble halls, a very different kind of celestial warfare was being waged in the deep forests of Europe, the sweeping savannas of Africa, and the remote highlands of Asia. This was the astrology of the insurgent, the rebel, and the tribal chieftain, a decentralized, deeply spiritual practice tailored for the guerrilla and the irregular fighter who lacked the vast resources of an empire but possessed an intimate, localized knowledge of the heavens above their homeland. In these smaller, more personal conflicts, astrology shed its elaborate mathematical complexity and became a potent tool for timing raids, inspiring resistance, and sustaining the morale of warriors who fought not for imperial glory, but for survival, freedom, and the defense of their way of life. This adaptation reveals the incredible versatility of celestial belief, proving that the perceived power of the stars was just as compelling for the partisan as it was for the legionary. Consider the Celtic tribes of ancient Europe who fiercely resisted the encroaching legions of Rome. Their military and spiritual leadership was embodied by the Druids, a learned class of priests, judges, and law-keepers. The Druids were renowned for their deep astronomical knowledge, maintaining a sophisticated calendar based on the cycles of the moon and the sun. For a Celtic chieftain planning a raid on a Roman supply convoy or a fortified outpost, the Council of the Druids was absolutely essential. They would determine the most auspicious time for action, paying close attention to the phases of the moon. A night raid was almost always scheduled for the dark of the moon, when the lack of light provided the best natural cover for stealthy movement and a surprise attack. But the symbolism went deeper. The waxing moon, growing brighter each night, was seen as a time for building strength and launching initiatives that required expansion and momentum. The waning moon, meanwhile, was associated with banishing, release, and the elimination of threats, a perfect time for an ambush designed to destroy an enemy patrol. This wasn't a vague superstition. It was a precise tactical clock, synchronizing human action with the most reliable celestial rhythm available, giving a group of outnumbered tribesmen a crucial edge against the greatest military machine the world had ever known. This pattern of localized celestial guidance repeated itself across the globe, particularly in Africa, where numerous cultures developed rich astrological traditions that were later weaponized in the face of colonial invasion. When European powers began their ruthless scramble for Africa in the 19th century, they often assumed they were facing disorganized, superstitious natives. They failed to understand that the resistance they encountered was frequently guided by a sophisticated and deeply rooted system of knowledge. Many African societies had long-standing traditions of celestial divination, where priestly castes or respected elders interpreted the movements of planets, the appearance of stars, and the patterns of constellations for guidance. As colonial pressures mounted, this spiritual practice became a core component of military resistance. A famous example can be found in the Magi rebellion against German colonial rule in East Africa in the early 20th century. The rebellion's leaders promoted the use of a sacred water, or Magi, which they claimed would turn German bullets into mere water. This spiritual belief was deeply intertwined with a celestial narrative, promising that the ancestors and the spirits of the natural world, communicated through the stars, would ensure victory for those who fought with pure hearts. This astrologically supported prophecy was a powerful unifying force, enabling different ethnic groups to unite under a common, divinely sanctioned cause against a technologically superior enemy. The key to astrology's power in these irregular conflicts was its deep accessibility and its role as a force multiplier for morale. An imperial army had professional astrologers with complex charts. A guerrilla band had a local shaman, a village elder, or even the commander's own intuitive reading of the signs. The practice was decentralized, adaptable, and required no special equipment beyond knowledge passed down through generations. Before a risky ambush, a Zulu impi might observe the behavior of certain birds or the position of Venus, the morning star, to determine if the spirits favored their attack. A Native American war party might delay a movement because of a dream interpreted as a bad omen by the tribe's seer. For these fighters, the certainty provided by a positive celestial sign was everything. It transformed a desperate, dangerous gamble into a sacred mission. A warrior who believed the stars were aligned in his favor would charge into battle with a courage that could overwhelm a better armed but less spiritually resolved opponent. This conviction could make a numerically inferior force feel invincible, turning the psychological tide of a skirmish in their favor. In the brutal calculus of asymmetric warfare, where belief often had to compensate for a lack of bullets, the heavens provided an inexhaustible supply of hope and resolution, proving that the most powerful weapon in any conflict is the unshakable spirit of the fighter who believes his cause is written in the very fabric of the universe. To truly grasp why brilliant military minds from Alexander to Saladin placed such faith in their stargazers, we must dismantle the modern barrier we erect between science and superstition. For them, no such barrier existed. The astrologer and the astronomer were often one and the same person, a scholar who meticulously tracked the movements of planets not just for their symbolic meaning, but for their predictable physical reality. This is the crucial, often overlooked nuance. The mystical framework of astrology was frequently built upon a bedrock of astonishingly accurate astronomical data. The same priest who interpreted a planetary conjunction as an omen of war could also calculate the exact date of the next lunar eclipse with remarkable precision. This dual expertise meant that a commander's celestial advisor was providing a blend of supernatural interpretation and hard, empirical intelligence, all wrapped in a single package. Dismissing it all as mere superstition ignores the very real tactical advantages that this knowledge could confer, advantages that had nothing to do with the favor of the gods and everything to do with a superior understanding of natural law. The most powerful example of this is the prediction of eclipses. For ancient civilizations, a solar eclipse was the ultimate terror. The sun, the source of all life, suddenly and inexplicably vanishing from the sky. It routinely caused mass panic, with armies breaking formation and populations interpreting it as a certain sign of divine wrath. However, cultures like the Babylonians and the Maya, through centuries of painstaking observation, had detected the long-term cycles that govern eclipses, such as the Saros cycle. Their astrologer priests could predict these events years, sometimes even decades, in advance. This knowledge was a weapon of immense psychological power. A general who knew an eclipse was due could turn a potential catastrophe into a devastating tactical opportunity. He could prepare his own troops, assuring them that the event was expected and was actually a sign of the gods' impending favor for them. Then, as the eclipse began and the enemy army descended into terrified disarray, he could order a full-scale attack against a force that was too busy panicking to mount a coherent defense. The celestial event itself was neutral. The advantage went to the commander who understood its mechanics, even if he explained those mechanics through a lens of divine intervention. This blurring of lines extended to the very tools of the trade. The astrolabe, a sophisticated brass instrument perfected by Islamic scholars, was a masterpiece of mathematical engineering. It could tell time, calculate latitudes, and map the positions of hundreds of stars. In the hands of a military advisor, it was used to cast astrological charts, determining the precise moment a planet entered a new zodiacal sign. But that same instrument was also absolutely vital for navigation on campaign, for surveying land for new fortifications, and for timekeeping, all essential, practical military functions. The user did not see a conflict between these purposes. Reading the sky for meaning and reading it for measurement were two sides of the same coin. The objective data was inseparable from its subjective interpretation. A navigator using the astrolabe to guide a fleet would note that the moon was in a certain phase, which gave him the tidal information he needed for a safe landing. But he might also note that the moon was in Pisces, a water sign, which he interpreted as an additional auspicious sign for a maritime operation. The tool provided both the fact and the framework for its meaning simultaneously. This is why so many of history's most pragmatic leaders, men we would consider rational and skeptical, still kept astrologers on their payroll. They were not necessarily gullible fools. They were consumers of the best intelligence apparatus available to them. The astrological report they received was the ancient equivalent of a modern intelligence briefing that combines satellite imagery, psychological profiling, and meteorological data. The advisor might say, Mars is in opposition to Saturn, which translated from the mystical code into practical terms could be a recommendation to delay an engagement because the planetary positions indicated a high risk of heavy casualties. A conclusion he may have reached by cross-referencing the time of year with historical records of past battles fought under similar seasonal and weather conditions. The symbolic language was the delivery system for insights that were often grounded in observed patterns and cumulative experience. The commander valued the council not because he blindly believed the planets were gods, but because he trusted the scholar's ability to discern patterns both in the stars and in human affairs that were invisible to everyone else. In a world without satellites or weather satellites, the astrologer's charts were the most sophisticated predictive model in existence, and wise rulers knew better than to ignore them. But the influence of celestial strategy extended far beyond the clash of battle lines, deeply embedding itself into the very lifeblood of any military campaign, its logistics. Moving an ancient army was a monumental undertaking, a slow and vulnerable procession of thousands of men, animals, and wagons carrying everything from grain and arrows to spare sandals and medical supplies. A single disrupted supply line could starve an entire legion into submission without the enemy ever drawing a sword. In this realm of immense risk and complexity, where a wrong decision could mean catastrophe, commanders sought every possible advantage to stack the odds in their favor, and that included consulting the cosmic calendar. The movement of provisions was not merely a matter of geography and availability. It was a matter of celestial timing. Before a vast grain convoy would depart from a port or a depot, a military astrologer would be consulted to elect the most auspicious moment for its journey. He would search for a time when Jupiter, the planet associated with expansion and abundance, was strong and well aspected in the chart, believing this would ensure the wagons remained full and the route stayed secure. Conversely, if malefic planets like Saturn or Mars were afflicting the signs associated with travel or commerce, the entire operation might be delayed for days or even weeks. This was not seen as a superstitious delay, but as a critical risk mitigation strategy, a way to avoid sending precious resources into a cosmic storm. This celestial oversight applied to every link in the logistical chain, the forging of new alliances with neutral tribes or client kings, an essential component for securing safe passage and local supplies, was also timed with astrological care. A Roman legate seeking to negotiate with a local chieftain would wait for a moment when Mercury, the planet of communication and agreement, was favorably placed and free from difficult aspects. The belief was that this would smooth the negotiations, making the chieftain more amenable and the resulting treaty more durable. Even the construction of permanent infrastructure, like the incredible network of Roman roads that enabled the empire's rapid military response, was subject to this cosmic planning. The founding of a new bridge or the groundbreaking ceremony for a new fort might be scheduled for a time when the Earth signs Taurus, Virgo, and Capricorn were dominant, as these signs were associated with stability, endurance, and construction, thereby ensuring the project would be solid and long-lasting. This holistic approach meant that from the granaries to the roads, the entire support system of the army was, in theory, harmonized with the universe, creating a campaign that was not just well-supplied but cosmically fortified. The Roman army provides the most detailed evidence of this practice integrated into a vast imperial system. There are accounts from historians suggesting that during certain periods, military marches could be delayed not because of enemy activity or bad weather, but because the planetary aspects were deemed unfavorable for movement. A Mars in retrograde, which was traditionally seen as causing confusion, disorder, and misplaced aggression, might convince a general to keep his legions within the fortified walls of their camp, rather than risk a march where supplies could be easily ambushed or where the troops themselves might become disoriented and mutinous under the negative influence. This was a profound expression of the belief that celestial forces didn't just influence human psychology, they could directly impact the material world. A supply wagon breaking an axle, a sudden outbreak of disease among the pack animals, or a missed rendezvous with a supply ship, these weren't just random misfortunes to the ancient mind. They were the direct result of operating out of sync with the cosmic order. By waiting for the right celestial conditions, a commander believed he was not just pleasing the gods, but actively engaging in a form of predictive logistics, avoiding the invisible pitfalls that could strangle his army far from home. This logistical dimension reveals the truly breathtaking scope of ancient military astrology. It was never just a tool for determining the day of battle. It was a comprehensive management system that sought to optimize every single variable of a campaign, from the spiritual morale of the soldier to the physical arrival of his bread ration. It aimed to align human ambition with the perceived rhythms of the universe, creating a seamless flow of men and material that moved in harmony with the heavens themselves. In the mind of an ancient commander, to ignore this celestial guidance was the height of recklessness. It was like setting sail without checking the weather or going into battle without a plan. The stars offered the ultimate intelligence report, a grand strategic overview that encompassed everything from the highest diplomatic maneuver to the most mundane movement of sacks of grain, all in the relentless pursuit of a single goal: to sustain the engine of war with the unwavering confidence that the cosmos itself was supplying its support. Yet this flow of celestial knowledge was never a one-way street. As Islamic empires expanded, their scholars didn't just preserve Greek texts, they actively improved upon them, incorporating insights from Persian, Indian, and even Chinese traditions they encountered. The astrological system that eventually filtered back into medieval Europe through places like Toledo in Spain and Palermo in Sicily was a profoundly syncretic one. It was a Greek framework, refined with precise Arabic mathematics and infused with concepts from across the known world. A European king consulting an astrologer in the 12th century was therefore tapping into a truly globalized network of knowledge, a shared celestial language that had been forged not in peace, but through the intense cultural pressure of conflict and conquest. This interconnected history offers a powerful reminder that even amidst the brutality of war, the human drive to understand the universe could create unexpected bridges, turning the sky above into a rare common ground where enemies could, in a way, still speak the same language. Yet even as the last imperial astrologers faded from court life, the seeds of a modern revival were quietly being planted, not in palaces or war rooms, but in the pages of fantasy novels and on the flickering screens of home computers. The late 20th century witnessed a surprising and profound resurgence of interest in these ancient practices, though now through a very different lens. This wasn't a return to belief, but a wave of fascinated rediscovery, driven by a cultural longing to understand how our ancestors saw the world. The catalyst was often entertainment. Blockbuster book series and epic role-playing games immersed millions in richly imagined worlds where magic and destiny were real, where characters might genuinely consult the stars before a battle. This fictional exposure sparked a very real curiosity. Audiences began to wonder, did people ever truly live this way? The answer, they discovered, was a resounding yes, and the journey to understand that lost world view opened up an entirely new field of historical inquiry, blending the thrill of discovery with the rigor of modern scholarship. This cultural curiosity found a powerful ally in the academic world, where a new generation of historians began applying interdisciplinary methods to old questions. They stopped dismissing astrology as mere superstition and started treating it as a serious historical actor. Using tools from psychology, sociology, and even economics, these scholars began to re-evaluate famous battles and political decisions. They asked not whether the stars really influenced events, but how the belief that they did shaped the choices of kings and commanders. This shift in perspective was revolutionary. Suddenly, the advice of a court astrologer could be analyzed as a form of risk assessment, a way to manage the overwhelming uncertainty of war. A decision to delay a march based on a bad omen could be seen not as ignorance, but as a prudent response to the perceived high risk of moving troops when morale was low. By peeling back the mystical language, historians revealed the sophisticated strategic thinking that often lay beneath it, giving us a much richer, more empathetic understanding of the past. This scholarly revival quickly spilled over into popular media, feeding a growing public appetite for these hidden histories. Documentaries began to dedicate entire episodes to the role of comets and eclipses in warfare, using cutting-edge CGI to recreate the celestial events that terrified ancient armies. Best-selling books unpacked the complex astrological codes that determined the fates of empires, making this esoteric knowledge accessible and thrilling to a general audience. Perhaps most surprisingly, video games, a medium often associated with pure escapism, became a powerful tool for historical simulation. Strategy games started incorporating authentic astrological mechanics. A player might see their troops' morale plummet if they ordered an attack during a digitally rendered eclipse, or receive a bonus to their diplomatic efforts if they initiated negotiations under a favorable planetary alignment. This interactive experience allowed people to almost feel the weight of these ancient beliefs, to understand on an intuitive level how a commander's decision-making calculus was profoundly different from our own. At its heart, this modern fascination is about more than just historical trivia. It's a profound exploration of the human mind under pressure. We are drawn to these stories because they hold up a mirror to our own relationship with uncertainty. In an age where we are inundated with data and predictive analytics, we still grapple with the same fundamental fears and hopes as a Roman general. His spreadsheet was a star chart. Ours is a complex algorithm, but the goal is identical: to reduce the terrifying unknown to a manageable formula. The resurgence of interest in military astrology reminds us that technology changes, but human nature does not. We still look for patterns, we still seek meaning in chaos, and we still crave a sense that the universe is on our side. The ancient astrologer gazing at the night sky and the modern-day scientist training a neural network are both engaged in the same timeless human endeavor, trying to read the signs of the world in order to navigate an uncertain future. And so our journey across this celestial battlefield draws to a close. We have traveled from the dusty plains of Mesopotamia, where priest astrologers first decoded divine omens in the movements of planets, to the sprawling forums of Rome, where emperors like Augustus wielded their horoscopes as weapons of propaganda and psychological control. We have stood beside Islamic scholars in the House of Wisdom as they preserved and advanced this ancient science, and we have seen how these beliefs crossed oceans with naval commanders and permeated the strategies of empires from China to India. This was not a fringe superstition but a central, sophisticated pillar of military planning for millennia, a system that sought to synchronize human ambition with the perceived rhythms of the universe itself. What this remarkable history ultimately reveals is a truth far more profound than the simple belief in stars controlling fate. It shows us the timeless, universal human yearning to find order in the midst of chaos, to impose a narrative of meaning onto the terrifying randomness of war and existence. Faced with the fog of war, ancient commanders reached for the best tools they had: a complex blend of early astronomy, keen observation, psychological insight, and spiritual belief. They were attempting to do what we still strive for today: to reduce uncertainty, to bolster morale, and to make the unpredictable seem just a little more manageable. Their spreadsheet was a star chart, their intelligence briefing was a planetary alignment. They used the language of their time to address the same fundamental challenges of leadership that persist to this day. The eventual decline of this practice, accelerated by the scientific revolution and the rise of empirical military science, did not mark the end of this human quest. It merely changed the tools. We no longer consult the position of Mars before a battle, but we pore over satellite data, weather reports, and predictive algorithms with the same intense hope of gaining an edge. The modern soldier's lucky charm or pre-mission ritual serves the same deep psychological purpose as the Roman legionary's faith in his emperor's celestial destiny. We have traded the ephemeris for the computer, but the desire to feel that the universe is on our side in moments of great peril remains a powerful, enduring part of the human spirit. So the next time you find yourself looking up at a clear night sky, take a moment to see it not just as a beautiful, silent expanse, but as an ancient command center. Those same stars and planets that shine down on us today were once meticulously tracked, debated, and feared by generals and emperors who believed their faint light held the key to victory or ruin. They are a silent monument to the incredible creativity, complexity, and sheer ingenuity of historical military thinking, a reminder that the drive to understand our world and our place within it is the most powerful weapon humanity has ever possessed. We hope this journey has changed the way you see the heavens above and the history books below. Let us know in the comments which empire's use of celestial strategy fascinated you the most, and be sure to subscribe and hit the bell for our next deep dive into history.